Hi everyone, welcome back to Research. This segment will focus on different ways that you can finance your pre-construction condo investments. For me, I had 4 sources of funding. Now, I should state 2 things for clarity. 1, my tolerance for short-term debt is pretty high because the projected net returns is still quite substantial. 2, I do not have 100% ownership in my condo investments, and that's based on the number 1 principle in investing, which is not to have all your eggs in one basket. What I realized is that this can actually also apply to your real estate portfolio as well. Just to provide some context into how all this started for me, I went to college after high school and I worked for a bit. But then I decided that I needed to go back to university or go to university to get a degree. And in hindsight, I definitely would have gone to trade school instead because it really fuses what I love and what I'm passionate about, which is the urban environment and construction. After I graduated from my undergrad, I was desperate to get into the pre-construction market. And what had caught my eye was Tribute's The College Project at College in Spadina. Because it's in this desirable area that's close to transit. It has a very lively neighborhood, and it was close to the University of Toronto. At this point in my life, I had no income and I had been rejected from all the graduate programs that I did apply to. And so it actually took me about a year to find full-time employment. This bout of unemployment really humbled me and really helped me prioritize what I would do with my future earnings and my future savings. And so during this year of unemployment, I was definitely getting anxious and scared that I wouldn't be able to find a job without a master's degree. So I took extra courses and then I reapplied to the programs. But then I actually finally landed an entry-level job, which was also reflected in the pay. And I got into a graduate program. So a bit of a dilemma here. I thought, do I leave the full-time job and go to school full-time, or what to do? So what I ended up deciding to do was both, primarily because I didn't want to be in school full-time and give up the income that I would make from my full-time job. And I also didn't want to wait until after I graduated to start my kind of pool of savings. The other benefit of being a graduate student is that you're actually eligible to become a teacher's assistant for undergraduate classes, which actually pays quite well. And so for me, what I ended up doing was I worked full-time, I went to school part-time, and then for the 3 years that I was in grad school, I TA'd 2 classes every semester. So needless to say that the 3 years were really, really tough, and it definitely helped realign my goals and increase my work ethic, but I made it through and here we are. The first source of funding for me were savings. And I definitely hustled for 3 years that contributed to a pretty good amount that I could start my investments with. Now, I'm not counting any of the income that I made after college or from the part-time job that I held out throughout high school, and primarily because I had spent it all. So if you're watching this early enough, let this be a reminder that you should really try to save as much as you can if you want to get into the pre-construction market, so that you don't have to rely on other sources of funding that may actually end up costing you money. The second source of funding I made use of was a line of credit. Now, I used the line of credit to bridge some of the gaps between some of the payments that I had. And please be very, very mindful that if you are making use of a line of credit, that you have to be very mindful and very responsible because it can be very tempting when you have such easy access to money. A line of credit is different from a credit card in that the interest rate is usually a fraction of what credit cards charge. Credit cards usually charge between 19 and 22%, and that's compounded on the balance that you owe and you carry month to month. In comparison, lines of credits are usually between 4 and 10%, and they use a simple interest method, which means that you only pay interest on the amount that you borrow. Recently, there have been some low interest credit card options introduced into the market, but the cash advance function, which is essentially what a line of credit is, the interest rate for that is actually still quite high in the low 20s. The Coles notes on the line of credit is that you need two things. One, really good credit. So make sure you pay all your bills on time and clear your credit card balances every month. And two, you have to have at least $35,000 to $50,000 of income in order to apply with financial institutions in Canada. Now, if you are going to make use of line of credit to bridge some of the gaps like I did, make sure you take into account the interest that you have paid on the amount that you borrowed so that you can get an accurate net profit calculation at the end of the day. The third source of funding is not really a source of funding, but it's more of a strategy to approach these types of investments. Now for me, equity sharing has really worked well because I'm able to own a chunk of multiple projects instead of having all my funds tied up into one. So a couple things to preface about my investments. Number one, they vary in height, and that is intentional because the height of the building impacts the length of construction. Number two, they're with different developers who have different track records. And number three, I have an estimated completion date, and that is not the date that the developer has identified during the sales period. That's mainly because that date that they initially identify is in an ideal world where construction goes their way and they get all their permits and approvals in place when they intended to get it. And that's usually not the case.
My first investment is in a 56-story tower, and the estimated completion is based on a nearby project that's actually 65 stories tall. That one took 7 years from public sales to occupancy. At the time of this video, construction is still below grade, so I don't anticipate that they'll be done anytime soon. Remember, had I pooled all my funds into this project, I would have had to wait at least 7 years to recoup my investment. The second investment is in the same area as the first, but it's not as tall, and construction is already above grade. This project was sold in 2 phases, and I bought in the first phase, so my side of the building will be completed first. The third investment is 30 stories tall and is actually behind schedule. The site has existing retail and commercial units that require demolition, so that adds another element to consider when you're researching. When there's an existing structure on the site, there are a couple things, mainly permitting related, that need to happen before the developer can even start excavating for the project you're buying. The fourth investment is a recent acquisition, and construction is slated to start in the spring of 2021. For now, considering it's only 13 stories, even though the floor plate is a bit larger, 2024 completion date seems reasonable at this time.
So as you can see, this approach will allow me to benefit from the returns more consistently. And the idea here is once you sell your first one, you'll be able to take the net profits, pay down your debt, and then use some of the gains to invest in your next one. Another benefit to equity sharing is that it definitely makes the payments more manageable in terms of when they're due and the amount that's actually due. I personally only partner with people that I know and I trust because I have to be able to rely on them to fulfill their obligation. And on the flip side, they also have to be able to rely on me to fulfill my obligations. No matter who you partner with, make sure you get into the habit of having an equity sharing agreement in place that's filed with the lawyer that you're going to have to retain for the transaction anyways. Now, it doesn't matter if it's your family, your best friend, or your significant other. It's really important to get into the habit of having the contributions and the due dates and the ownership percentages all spelled out so that in the event of a dispute, everything has already been previously agreed to. Now, equity sharing as a concept is not new. It's actually the principle behind other sorts of real estate investments called a real estate investment trust, or a REIT for short. And this is more of a hands-off approach if this is more your style, where a bunch of people pool their money together and they entrust the funds to a manager who will purchase an asset, a real estate asset, and who will manage it on your behalf. So you technically own a little piece of the real estate asset, but it's really hands-off. And for me, I'm a really hands-on type of person, which is also why I should have went to trade school. And so I really enjoy being the broker of equity sharing, so to speak. So really find what works for you. The last source of funding I have is from a side hustle. Now, I find that in the short term, while you're trying to finance your investments in the beginning stages, you definitely need to keep a side hustle. Now, this is in addition to the full-time job that I already have, and this is separate from the savings that I've already used to fund most of the installments. Now, the side hustle can go on for as long as you personally need. It could be short, it could be long-term. That's really dependent on your financial condition. So since finishing graduate school, I was no longer able to TA undergraduate classes, and I've had to maintain a side hustle since graduating. Now, the income from the side hustle is definitely a lot lower than what I made when I was a TA, but I've also increased my daytime income significantly as well. So this isn't as detrimental to me. Also, because I made my first purchase 2 years ago, many of the installments and even for the second investment have already been paid. Maintaining the side hustle is really just to keep my work ethic up and to continually pay down the line of credit. The important thing to keep in mind is to not let your side hustle increase your standard of living so significantly that you're no longer able to afford it. And I'm not saying that you should, live like a student with no income, but there's definitely some trade-offs and some balance to be had here. Remember why you're keeping a side hustle in the first place. In these times, especially during the beginning phases, you really have to think like a millionaire, but hustle like you're broke. Remember, this is a temporary condition, and once you reap the benefits from your first investment, you'll see that it's worth it. Okay, so these were the 4 things that I did to finance my pre-construction investments. I'm really looking forward to being able to sell the first one, which should be in the next 18 to 20 months. The first priority is definitely to pay off the debt, but I can't wait to sell the first one and continue to expand. We'll see you next time on Research. Thanks for tuning in.